Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Michael Scheuer, who is the former head of the CIA's Bin Laden unit and of its rendition program. His new book is Marching Toward Hell: America and Islam After Iraq. Michael, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for having me.
Where were you born and raised?
In Buffalo, New York, a little town outside of Buffalo.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
Oh, I think they were of what's called the greatest generation, and they were very, my parents were very patriotic. Voting was very important to them, and doing the right thing for your country and for your locality was always very important. So I think I was very much grounded in that kind of a attitude.
And what got you interested in world politics? I mean, were you reading the newspaper when you were young?
Not really. I studied history in school, and when I finished my PhD, there was no jobs for history teachers, and I just took a flyer at applying for the Central Intelligence Agency, and I was extraordinarily fortunate to be accepted, and I had a very, from my perspective, a very wonderful career there.
And so let's talk a little about your education. Where did you get your degree?
I did a bachelor's degree in history at Canisius College in Buffalo, a little Jesuit school. A master's degree in American history at Niagara University, which is up by Niagara Falls, New York. I did a master's in Canadian-American relations at Carleton in Ottawa. And my PhD is in British Empire from the University of Manitoba at Winnipeg. And
did you work on the British Empire's global politics, or what?
I'm so old, sir, that I worked in the British Empire in what was called then the White Dominions before World War I. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and oddly enough, South Africa was characterized as a White Dominion.
Mm-hmm. So what did you just, by chance, as you said, wind up in the CIA?
Well, by desire. Yeah. Because I was working at the time in Buffalo at Union Carbide. I was a crane driver, and I was working outside on the third shift, and I was about ready to take any job that would get me outside, away from being outside. And the agency then under Mr. Reagan and Director Casey were hiring a lot of historians, and I took a chance, and I was very fortunate to be hired.
And so the Cold War was still going on when you joined up?
Yes.
But you chose to actually focus on the Muslim world.
I did. I spent 2 years when I first arrived at the agency working on Europe and NATO affairs, and that was pretty deadly in the sense of being uninteresting. And in 1985, I went to work in the Directorate of Operations initially to work on the support program for the Afghan Mujahideen against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and I stayed the rest of my career working on Middle Eastern or Islamic things.
Help us understand the skills that are required to be a CIA agent.
Well, you have to be able to pass the polygraph, first of all. You know, I don't think there's any formula. The agency is a very small d democratic place. If you have a skill of some kind and an academic record that's passable, there's a job for you. I think one of the great things in my career, being trained as a historian, was being able to appreciate the importance of different cultures and different religions on how events are perceived. I think that goes a long way. The ability to do a simple analogy, saying we've seen this before somewhere, is very important. And a high degree of tolerance for bureaucratic lunacy is also very important.
And is there a sharp distinction between the analyst type on the one hand and the special ops type? I mean, are there very different skills involved?
There are different skills, sir. I think they're less, it depends on what area you're working in. If you're a case officer on the operations side and you're working against China, that's a whole different job than working against terrorism. I think in the agency, the difference between analysts and operators in the area of terrorism is much smaller than it is against traditional nation-state targets, whether it's Germany or China or Russia.
Mm-hmm. And why is that?
It's because one of the main reasons is because it goes across continents. When you're running an operation, for example, against Al-Qaeda, Very often you're working with 3 or 4 different countries on 2 or 3 different continents. And so headquarters becomes very much a player. When you're working against a specific country, the people that are in country carry the basic load. But when you're working against terrorism across that geographical dispersion, headquarters becomes a very much more important element to manage and to tell the people in the field what they're seeing.
Now, when you're talking about headquarters, you're talking about headquarters in the CIA. So the question immediately arises, are people following terrorism in some ways better informed than people who are dealing with traditional nation states?
I wouldn't say they're better informed, sir. Their information is more broadly dispersed.
Okay.
If you're going to find, if you're going to track Al-Qaeda, for example, or any Sunni Islamic group, you're going to have a familiarity with cultures in Africa, in the Southeast Asia.
So you have to be a comparativist in a way.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to be able to do that, and you have to have a little brass to you, you know, because it's not a comfortable thing. Some people are trained to be experts in the Arab world, but if you're going to work against terrorism, you also have to know what Islam looks like in the South Pacific, for example. So it takes a little bit of courage to expand yourself. I
have a quote here that I want to read you. This is, I think you told this, you were talking to Frontline, and you said this: the test of an intelligence officer is not so much the ability to accumulate information, it's to judge between different pieces of information, and not to take a piece of information and use it in a piece of analysis simply because it fits your case, but to use it because it either comes from a reliable source, like signal intercepts from a human source that has been vetted over time as a reliable person, or it comes from documentary information, papers you've stolen from another government or another organization. Talk a little about that, because it's very intriguing. I mean, you have to be pretty thoughtful about what you're reading before you.
You know, in this age, in the age of the internet, for example, you can basically construct a piece of analysis that proves that you're the Queen of England, really, if you wanted to.
Yeah.
There's no problem with that. And the problem in the government at the moment, and I think we saw it in Iraq, is they do what they call cherry picking. They pick the pieces of intelligence that fit the answer that they want to arrive at. And really, an intelligence officer is worthless if he's not able to have the courage, the capacity to say, no, this piece of information is just not reliable. We have to go with this one. It may not fit what the president wants to do, but this is the more reliable information at hand. And so it becomes a very difficult task in many ways. You have to be able to stand up and say, you know, no matter what you want to do, Mr. President, this is the reality, or Mr. Secretary of State, or Mr. Secretary of Defense. And the amount of information out there is, as you know, sir, astounding. It's overwhelming in many ways. And so in some ways, good intelligence officers today are much more valuable than they've ever been before, because it's their duty to pick between the good things and the bad things, the valid things and the invalid things.
Let's take a case study here, and obviously what suggests itself is the Bin Laden unit. How did Bin Laden, let's go back to the origins of that unit. How did what were the circumstances under which he emerged on the radar? Was it the actual attacks against the facilities in Saudi Arabia and so on, or was it even before that you began to see information that was disturbing?
Well, we began to see information about Osama Bin Laden during the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan. And truth to tell, we tried to get in touch with him in the late 80s, middle 80s, and he hated us then. He didn't want any part of us. He had his own sources of money, his own sources of arms, and so he wouldn't talk to us. But when we first began to pay very serious attention to him was after the Soviets left Afghanistan in '89.